Hi, I'm Daryl, and today we're going to talk about creating a sound information architecture in Confluence. Now, we've got a lot of ground to cover today, so we're going to dive right in and plow through it, and save questions till the end. So let's get started. First, a bit about who we are. Brikit is a Seattle-based company with teams in North America and Europe. And we've been an Atlassian expert partner, providing great service to our customers and building award-winning add-ons for Atlassian products since 2005. And our business is helping companies make better use of Confluence to connect people and share ideas. We serve large and small organizations in nearly 60 countries, in industries spanning commercial, government, education, and the nonprofit sectors. And today, this is the first in our Confluence Roadmap for Success series, where we'll be addressing some of the top issues facing Confluence users based on our experience, our customers, and feedback received by Atlassian's customer and product advocates teams. To give you a sneak peek, after years of working with customers, we've learned that to be successful with Confluence, there are 3 areas you need to look after: tools, information architecture, and design, which all play together and reinforce one another and must be built on a foundation of continuous improvement. And today's webinar is actually a distillation of our information architecture service package, which is the process that we go through with our customers. For more information, you can visit our website. Now, whether building for social intranets, documentation, team collaboration, or whatever, we're always trying to help our clients get the entire organization to use Confluence. And this is because you've already made an investment in Confluence, and there's a direct relationship between the number of people that use it and the return that you get from that investment. And since Confluence is naturally popular with technical teams, this means that we spend a lot of our time thinking about how to best serve non-technical audiences, or large audiences that are technical, which kind of behave like non-technical audiences. Now, to be clear, I'm talking about people who may laugh at this, but almost never this. Now, we're starting with information architecture because it addresses the #1 complaint we hear from Confluence users: I can't find anything, which is followed closely by the #2 complaint: where do I put stuff? And for our non-technical audience who hasn't already bought into Confluence, the search bar is unfortunately not the answer. It works great if you already know what's out there, but it's bad for new users who don't. And it does little to help you when you have something that you want to contribute, which leaves in place a roadblock for user adoption, which means that not everybody who could be will be using it, which means that you're losing an opportunity. So why is finding stuff such a problem? Well, it's because a collaborative environment always involves information about 2 very complex things: your organization, the divisions, products, departments, teams, etc., and tools. In Confluence, that means space categories and spaces and pages and trees and labels, etc., etc. Now, the first one is naturally complex, and the second one should be complex because you need powerful tools to solve complex problems. Unfortunately, most organizations roll out Confluence and don't sufficiently deal with that complexity. So over time, they end up with an information free-for-all, or what some of our customers call the Wiki Wild West. And too often we see information architectures that look a little too much like this, which are kind of interesting, but they're really hard to fathom. So what is information architecture anyway, and how can it help? Well, information architecture is the art and science of organizing the features and structures of your tools to fit and reflect your organization, and most specifically not the other way around. Or to put it another way, you want to use tool features to create a model of your organization. And doing this well means that what you have in Confluence will make sense to users because they can look at it and see familiar elements from their environment reflected back to them, both structure and concepts. So now that we know what it is and what the benefits are, the goals for any information architecture should be pretty obvious. We want to make it fit your organization and make it flexible to evolve with you as you grow. We also want to make it as self-managing as we can, and we sure want to get it right the first time so it will work forever. Okay, that's a joke. I admit that's not possible. We can't do that. But we do want to make regular updates part of your planning because your organization and your tools will evolve, and time and learning will uncover new opportunities and pain points. So how can we accomplish all of that? Well, unfortunately, getting it right isn't a matter of simply connecting the dots in the right order. It's about exploring and learning those two complex elements, your tools and your organization, coming up with your best shot at mapping them together, testing your design, refining that based on what you learn, and repeating. Now, we recommend planning for at least 3 iterations up front. And in fact, when we work with our customers, we do 5 before deploying. And then after you launch, plan to come back on a semi-annual basis to continue gardening to keep things healthy. The first step is to get a handle on the capabilities of your system. You'll want a solid understanding of Confluence and the various add-ons and how they all work together to provide structures that you can map to your organization. And we like to start with the tools first because their features provide lenses through which we can look at the organization, or if you prefer, hooks on which to hang organizational concepts. And next is to develop a shared understanding of your organization's information and its complex relationships. Now, I can practically guarantee that just about everyone in your organization already has some kind of a mental picture for that. And I can almost guarantee that if you ask 10 random people in your organization, they're going to paint 10 widely different pictures. And it gets more elusive when you get to the level of what information is needed, how it should be organized, shared, etc. But the good news is that pretty much all these pictures are valid and that they will all tend to contain the same elements. So your goal then is to mine them and get them organized. Okay, so far we've been talking at a pretty high level, but now we're going to dive into the details. Let's do it. Now, as we said, you or someone on your team will need to have a thorough understanding of Confluence features and structures, and also relevant add-ons such as Confluence Questions or Brikit ThemePress, and integration points such as Atlassian HipChat, Jira Service Desk, or Jira. Now, this takes time and effort, so it's essential that you allow yourself space and time to do so. And really, there are only 3 ways to get there. Spend time reading and experimenting, get some training, or hire an expert, or some combination of the above. Now let's look at what you need to know. Confluence's rich feature set provides many components that we can use to design our information architecture. If there's any downside at all, it's that this list makes for a not-so-short list of concepts to learn. Now, I won't go through them all, but to help you, here are cheat sheets of our favorites that we like to consider when building an information architecture. And as we said, these will be all online, so you can come back and use these as a reference. Don't worry about them today. In addition, there are a handful of essential add-ons that you should consider, and each one has their own feature set. 2 of our favorites are for creating social intranets. Those are Confluence Questions and our own Brikit ThemePress. And 2 other Atlassian products that provide additional power tools that can help reduce the burden on your information architecture are HipChat, which kind of helps out with the more unstructured and dynamic collaboration. And on the other end of the spectrum, Jira Service Desk offers more structured help and collaboration support. Now, it's important to remember, don't panic. There's a lot of information that we're going to have to get on top of, but we're following an iterative process, so you don't have to eat the whole elephant in one bite. And when planning your organization's structure from an information sharing perspective, there's a lot to think about, right? As we discussed, there are a lot of different ideas already in people's heads, and if you look out there, there's virtually a boundless amount of information theory ready to quote-unquote help you. Now, our trick here is to approach your organization by thinking along each of several facets, using broad strokes at first, because remember, we're going to iterate, and then drilling down as needed to map to tool features. Again, these are our cheat sheets. It's not a hard and fast list, but intended as a starting point. You can tailor or extend these to make sense for your organization. Now that you have a handle on both your organization's information sharing needs and the capabilities of your tool set, it's time for some fun. Or at least it's fun if you like hard puzzles. But before we get completely started, let's look at 3 important patterns that we're going to be using for Confluence in information architecture. And that's taxonomy, what we like to call habitat, and permissions. Taxonomy is just a fancy word for grouping related things without regard to location. For example, biologists have noticed huge, long-nosed, floppy-eared animals, and also giant, hunting, furry, purring animals scattered throughout Africa and Asia. They tend to clump together in local groups and intermingle in various ways. There are lots of variations and subtypes among them, but it's extremely handy for lots of reasons to be able to refer to them as elephants and lions. And if you're at all familiar with Confluence features, you can see where this is going. In general, taxonomy maps to things like space categories, page and attachment labels, time or recency or how old something is, right? Blueprint types, page properties and topics if you're using questions, and so on. A couple of quick examples to illustrate. If I'm looking for candidates for space categories, I'm going to be looking at business units, geographies, business functions, that kind of thing. Right? On the other side, if I'm going to be looking for candidates for page or attachment labels, I'll be considering things like document types, like product specifications or meeting minutes. In fact, Confluence's blueprints do a good job of this already, so you can look at those for several examples of that kind of thing. Another example that we like to pursue is prioritization. So for example, using a label called featured on important blog posts that we want to feature on a home page. Now, habitat is how we describe where information lives. And to continue that example, lions and elephants tend to clump together in local groups, inhabit certain regions, which are in turn located in different continents. And these are useful levels to think about their organization. But going further and thinking about the planet Earth, our solar system, or even our place in the universe may be technically correct and even philosophically interesting, but it doesn't add much useful context. So we recommend trying to stay focused on pragmatic levels. Now again, I think you can see where this is going. Habitat is going to map to things like spaces, page hierarchies or trees, pages, file attachments, and so on. A couple of quick examples. If I'm looking for candidates for spaces or page trees, I'm going to be looking at things like projects and teams, services, products, campaigns, that kind of thing. Right? Now wait a minute, I know what you're going to ask. You're going to say, how do you know when to create a space versus a page tree? Well, this is a point that everyone struggles with, and that's because there's no hard and fast rule. However, we recommend keep it flat, because deep page hierarchies are difficult to navigate and maintain. And too few spaces is also the leading cause of what we call giant disorganized page tree syndrome. Also, more spaces means that you have better focus when in the space because you're just seeing relevant content around there. You don't have to filter out what else there is. But keeping it flat requires things like navigation, such as menus. And likewise, those can become difficult to navigate or maintain when they get large. Right? So we recommend a peel the onion strategy. And basically at your top level pages or top level home pages, we're going to be presenting only organizational concepts and navigation. And then as you drill deeper into the site or your organization, basically, you're going to be presenting local menus with concepts that are relevant in that context. Okay, one more reason to go for spaces instead of page trees is the third information architecture pattern that we're looking at today, and that's permissions. Now, as you know, permissions define what users can see and do. And going back to our animal example, we might like to subdivide lion-inhabited areas into places where they are allowed, like the grasslands, and where they're not, such as your neighborhood or children's school. Now in Confluence, we can likewise divide the habitat level concepts according to permissions. And the most flexible and convenient way to arrange permissions is at the space level. Other permissions play a part too, such as global permissions and page permissions, but these should take a distant backseat to space permissions. Now it's usually not necessary to split up spaces due to permissions, because permissions frequently align with departments and projects and other things that naturally you're going to create spaces for. But in some cases they don't. Now reviewing your organizational structure information from above usually makes those cases obvious. Now your permission strategy should be kept as simple as possible. And we found that most organizations do not have complex permission needs. However, we found that most organizations start off thinking that they do. So when permissions start to get complicated, it's usually a good idea to consider reworking your space architecture or relaxing permissions. Because open is better, and remember, people are logged in. If they do anything, their name is going to be on it. So they tend to behave. So really you have to think more only about information security issues. Now in Confluence, as you know, best practice is to grant permissions to groups and not users. And typical candidates for groups include pretty much anything on your org chart, roles, especially in matrix managed organizations, and don't forget about your external groups, your customers and partners that you'll be collaborating with on the Confluence platform. So now we've done quite a bit of legwork and we're ready to take a swipe at our information architecture. Now this is where we combine your knowledge of the tool features, the organizational information structure from above, and your past experience with Confluence. And then you make up a straw man information architecture, which is a set of documents that will accomplish three things. They'll guide you through this process, they'll serve as a guide to users after launch, and they're going to be the base for updating the information architecture in 6 months. So they're pretty important. So to do this, we're going to go through that information, or the organizational information structure, one section at a time, and review the Confluence tool features above, and start sketching out your taxonomy and habitat. Now don't spend too much time on each section. You'll want to pass through them all first to avoid any one perspective from being emphasized too heavily. Now usually during this pass, it will start to become clear which elements are going to be the most important for your organization. And here again, you want to keep these documents super simple. And this is really important because they're going to evolve a lot, which will bog down the process if you get too fancy annotating it. Also, you can help keep it simple by considering just your information needs for the next 6 months, because after that you'll come back and repeat the process, right? Now for documenting habitat, we like to start with a simple table where you can map out categories, spaces, etc., and add in key permissions. And that's it, nice and simple. For groups, we like to list the key groups in another simple table to stay focused on a small core subset. And this is important because in your Active Directory, your LDAP server, there's probably a ton of groups defined, and those get pulled into Confluence. But really, for practical reasons, only a small subset of those are relevant for permissions planning. So we like to call those out into a table. And then we also like to add global permissions to this table, looking for ways to keep this level both safe and simple, such as disabling the can use Confluence permissions for the default group in systems that are shared with external parties. For taxonomy, again, keep it simple and create separate lists for things like space categories, page and attachment labels. If you're using Confluence questions, you will list out some sample topics you figure people are going to be heading for. And if you're using blueprints, document those separately as well. Even though those are provided by the Confluence user interface, I think it makes sense to document them to make their use explicit to users, especially if you plan to restrict their use in different spaces. Oh, and always remember that space categories are usually much easier to manage than individual spaces, so use the category concept. Some tips is that fewer is always better, and we'd like to split words that can work together or as separate concepts. So instead of African elephant, use Africa and elephant. Or the opposite is true, to keep words together that only work well as a single concept, like watering hole. And finally, it's really important to use the words that your organization commonly uses, and don't try to get clever or nobody's going to know what you're talking about. And this is a good place where you want to do some interviewing of people in your organization. Now, once this whole picture starts to come together, we recommend that you set up a new Confluence development server and just create spaces and categories and stub out just the home pages and the key page hierarchy routes. Keep it nice and light and simple. And then we'd like to create a page using the spaces list macro, which is built into Confluence, to provide a handy overview of the spaces and categories in a browser format. And when you do that, you're going to see why it's important to add those space descriptions when you're doing the space details. And then we want to make sure everyone in the organization who uses Confluence knows about this page so they can learn from that. So you're going to want to include that in your onboarding or training. Now, a common question is, where should this page live? Well, we like creating a space dedicated to documenting and discussing how your company uses Confluence. Now, for the site homepage and the space homepages, think about navigation, things like menus and headers and footers, breadcrumbs, page trees, things like that. Now, one tip also is to create a landing space and use that instead of the dashboard for regular users. And we like to also try to automate homepages with data feeds, building those using taxonomy and macros. Also look for ways to delegate responsibilities to space owners. And remember to defer complexity with that peel the onion strategy we talked about. Now, one more thing to consider is that we often hear requirements specified in terms of clicks. For example, everything has to be within 3 clicks, or 5 clicks, or whatever. But usability studies have shown that when trying to find information, it's not the number of clicks that matters, but what's called the scent of information. Now, this means that as long as the user can find obvious steps that bring them closer to what they're looking for, like a bloodhound following a hunting trail, the perceived number of clicks is actually lower than what they experience, and the perception of the organization is high, and usability is high. Now, conversely, a low number of clicks in a poorly organized system creates the opposite impression. Now, because many of these can be challenging with out-of-the-box Confluence, remember it's built for technical audiences, and for them the search bar is all they need. This is an area where you probably want to consider add-ons to provide additional functionality. For example, our ThemePress add-on for Confluence provides additional navigation aids and macros plus design capabilities to help you visually organize information. It's the only theming product that doesn't require custom HTML and CSS, so it's future-proof for Confluence upgrades. Now, ThemePress enables several navigation elements. We get menus with fancy menu panels. We get navigation elements that are applied uniformly using page layouts, and footers that add sitemaps to keep users oriented as they move around. Okay, you've built it and now you're ready to test. So you step back and see how it feels. You're going to be asking what if and where does it go kinds of questions of this. And you're going to want to test drive with as broad a set of users as possible, both technical and non-technical. So be sure to involve your people like the sales folks, project managers, marketing and HR, and senior management if you can get some of their attention. And plan on at least 3 iterations up front, and each time go through and update your information architecture, permissions, your stubbed out spaces and key page routes, landing pages and navigation. And if you can, it's a good idea to try to replace half of your test team with each iteration, because some people won't have time to engage, and of course fresh pairs of eyes are always invaluable. And now you're ready to deploy. Now if it's a new site, you simply move your stubbed out content to production and start going. But if you have existing content, you'll have to decide how to move it. You'll either have a big mess already, or maybe well organized or light content, which you can either take those and install our new structures and move pages, or repurpose your existing spaces to match your architecture instead of moving everything. But specific strategies are beyond the scope of this webinar. Launching is also beyond the scope of this webinar, but I wanted to mention that it's worth creating a plan to make sure that all your hard work gets noticed, gets used, and gets cared for. Now here's a few user adoption strategies to seed your thinking, and I won't go through them all today because we don't have time, but I'll leave them here as a list you can return to. And then during launch, you'll also want to create a feedback loop to support improving the system over time. Now feel free to implement obvious improvements as you go, but be sure to update the information architecture documents. But do save the more complex or contentious ideas for the 6-month reviews. This will give you time to gain experience which you can use to validate those ideas, and it's also when you're going to have the next opportunity to spend time testing major new design changes. And do not wait. Right away, schedule your next review cycle. Aim for 6 months, plan to update your tools and licenses and all that, revise your information architecture, and to update your content and design. Because remember the roadmap for success. To succeed with Confluence, you need to look after all these things. But if you follow the steps above, you're going to be well on your way. We also hope you'll take a look at ThemePress, which we've designed to support your information architecture, to simplify Confluence for non-technical users, and visually fit your organization. And with no custom coding, it's future-proof for the long term. Now we'll leave off with a summary of the best practices we've covered today. I won't read through them all, but here they are for future reference. And also a list of the common mistakes that folks make when working through an information architecture. And we'll take a moment for a quick shout out to the great contributors on Flickr. And to learn more, please visit our website or drop us a note. And we have a few minutes left, so we'll see what questions we can answer. Thanks for listening.